The moment I saw Dahlia glide through the chapel doors in that floor-length ivory gown, her smile radiant as she posed for photos at MY wedding, I knew exactly what kind of sister I was dealing with. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew as they whispered and gasped at her audacious choice, was that her little stunt would cost her everything she held dear. 3 years later, I would stand in a courtroom wearing her husband's wedding ring on a chain around my neck, watching her world crumble just as spectacularly as she'd tried to destroy mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Celeste Montgomery, and this is the story of how my sister's jealousy became her downfall, and how patience, planning, and a little bit of poetic justice can serve a dish that's been chilling for years. Let me paint you the picture of that September morning in Willowbrook, a quaint New England town where gossip travels faster than wildfire, and family scandals become legendary dinner party conversations. The chapel bells of St. Augustine's were ringing their celebratory tune as guests filed into the historic stone building where 4 generations of Montgomery women had walked down the aisle. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews that would soon witness what our social circle still refers to as the white dress incident. I was in the bridal suite, putting the finishing touches on my makeup when my maid of honor, Penelope, burst through the door with a look of absolute horror plastered across her face. Her usually perfect composure, she was, after all, a successful attorney who rarely lost her cool, had completely evaporated. "Celeste," she whispered, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "we have a situation." Before I could ask what was wrong, she grabbed my shoulders and spun me away from the antique mirror where I'd been adjusting my grandmother's pearl necklace. "Your sister just arrived." "Good," I replied, confused by her obvious distress. I was worried she might be running late. "You know how Dahlia is with..." "She's wearing white." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Surely my sister, for all her dramatic tendencies and attention-seeking behavior, wouldn't dare cross that particular line. Even Dahlia had boundaries. Or so I'd foolishly believed. "What do you mean she's wearing white?" I asked, my voice unnaturally calm in the way it gets when your brain is processing something so outrageous, it hasn't triggered the appropriate emotional response yet. Penelope's expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding about ivory versus cream, or some fashion faux pas involving a white blazer over a navy dress. This was deliberate, calculated, and designed for maximum impact. "I mean," Penelope said slowly, "she's wearing a full-length, sleeveless, ivory silk gown with a train and a fucking tiara, Celeste. She looks like she's competing for the role of bride, and from the way people are staring, I'd say she's winning." The strangest thing happened in that moment. Instead of the rage or heartbreak I should have felt, a peculiar clarity washed over me. It was as if someone had adjusted the focus on a camera lens, and suddenly, everything about my relationship with my sister came into sharp, undeniable focus. This wasn't just a moment of poor judgment or sisterly competition gone too far. This was Dahlia showing me exactly who she was and what she thought of me, my happiness, and this moment I'd spent 2 years planning. I walked to the window that overlooked the chapel's entrance and peered through the sheer curtains. There she was, my 28-year-old sister, posing for photos with our elderly Aunt Cordelia, her ivory dress catching the morning light like she was the star of her own personal photo shoot. Her husband, Trevor Blackthorne, stood beside her looking distinctly uncomfortable in his charcoal gray suit, his jaw tight with what I recognized as barely contained embarrassment. Even from 2 floors up, I could see him trying to guide her toward the chapel entrance, probably hoping to minimize the spectacle, but Dahlia was having none of it. She was in her element, soaking up the shocked attention of our relatives and family friends like a flower absorbing sunlight. "Should I go down there and say something?" Penelope asked, her lawyer instincts clearly ready to go into protective mode. "Because I will absolutely destroy her in front of everyone. You just say the word." I turned away from the window and looked at myself in the mirror. My dress was a vision of classic elegance. A silk organza creation with delicate lace sleeves and a modest train that had cost more than some people's cars. My dark auburn hair was swept into an intricate updo adorned with my grandmother's vintage hairpins. I looked exactly like what I was, a bride on her wedding day, radiant with joy and anticipation. Dahlia could wear white until the cows came home, but she would never have what I had in that moment: genuine love, authentic happiness, and the respect of everyone who mattered. "No," I said quietly, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Let her have her moment." Penelope stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious right now? She's trying to upstage you at your own wedding, and you're just going to let her?" I turned to face my best friend, and I suppose something in my expression must have alarmed her because she took a step back. "Oh, I'm going to let her do this," I said, my voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. "In fact, I'm going to make sure everyone gets a really good look at exactly the kind of person Dahlia Montgomery Blackthorne is. Because you know what? She just gave me the most valuable gift she could possibly give. Which is the absolute moral high ground. And trust me, Penny, I'm going to use every inch of it." What I didn't tell my maid of honor in that moment, what I couldn't have known then, was that Dahlia's white dress would become the first domino in a chain reaction that would ultimately destroy her marriage, her social standing, and her carefully constructed life. Because while she was downstairs playing dress-up and making a mockery of my wedding day, she was also revealing to me and everyone else present exactly who she really was, beneath all that designer clothing and practiced charm. And sometimes, when people show you their true nature, the kindest thing you can do is believe them. Before we continue with the rest of this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you think family loyalty has limits, because after today, you might change your mind about what those limits should be. Tomorrow, I'm sharing something even more shocking about what happened after the wedding photos were developed, so make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss how this revenge story unfolds. But first, let me tell you about the moment I realized that my sister wearing white to my wedding wasn't the worst thing she would do to me that year. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before I tell you about the war that would consume the next 3 years of my life, you need to understand what Dahlia and I were fighting over. It wasn't just about a wedding dress or sibling rivalry. It was about everything our family represented, everything we'd been raised to become, and the life I'd worked so hard to build in Willowbrook. The Montgomery family had been a cornerstone of New England society for over a century. Our great-grandfather, Augustus Montgomery, had founded Montgomery & Associates, the most prestigious law firm between Boston and Hartford. Our grandmother, Vivienne Montgomery, had been the kind of woman who hosted charity galas that raised 6 figures and never had a hair out of place. Our parents, Judge Reginald Montgomery and philanthropist Anastasia Montgomery, continued that legacy of respectability and influence that opened doors and commanded respect throughout Connecticut's social circles. Growing up in the Montgomery Mansion on Elmwood Avenue, a sprawling Victorian estate with perfectly manicured gardens and a ballroom that had hosted governors and senators, Dahlia and I were raised to be the next generation of Montgomery women. We attended the finest private schools, spent summers in the family cottage on Nantucket, and were groomed from birth to marry well, contribute meaningfully to society, and maintain the family's sterling reputation. The difference was, I actually embraced it. While Dahlia spent her teenage years rebelling against our parents' expectations, sneaking out to parties, dating boys from the wrong side of town, getting suspended for smoking behind the gymnasium, I was methodically building the life our family envisioned. I graduated valedictorian from Willowbrook Academy, earned my degree in art history from Vassar College, and returned home to establish the Montgomery Cultural Foundation, a nonprofit that brought arts education to underprivileged children throughout the region. By the time I was 26, I had everything a Montgomery woman was supposed to have: a successful career that served the community, a spotless reputation, and most importantly, I had found my perfect match in Jonathan Ashworth. Jonathan was everything our parents could have dreamed of in a son-in-law. His family owned Ashworth Industries, a manufacturing company that had been supplying textiles to high-end fashion houses for 3 generations. He was handsome in that understated aristocratic way, tall and lean with sandy brown hair that never seemed out of place, gray eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and the kind of natural confidence that came from never having to question his place in the world. We met at a charity auction for the Willowbrook Historical Society, where I was representing my foundation and he was bidding on behalf of his family's corporate giving initiative. He won a weekend at a vineyard in Tuscany and, in a moment of romantic spontaneity that still makes my heart flutter, asked if I'd like to help him enjoy it. 6 months later, we were inseparable. A year after that, he proposed during intermission at the Metropolitan Opera, getting down on one knee in the grand foyer while well-dressed patrons applauded our fairy tale moment. Our engagement was everything a society wedding should be. The announcement in the Willowbrook Gazette featured a stunning photograph of us at the autumn cotillion, me in emerald silk that brought out my eyes, Jonathan in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. The engagement party at the country club was attended by 300 of our closest friends and family, with champagne flowing and a 12-piece orchestra playing classical waltzes under twinkling lights in the garden pavilion. For 2 years, I planned our wedding with the meticulous attention to detail that had made my foundation events the most successful fundraisers in the county. Every element was carefully chosen to reflect both our family's traditions and our own personal style. The invitations were hand-calligraphed on cream cardstock with navy ink. The flowers were white peonies and garden roses, arranged by the same florist who had done my grandmother's golden anniversary celebration, and the reception would be held at Rosewood Manor, the historic estate where my great-grandparents had celebrated their own wedding in 1923. Everyone said we were the perfect couple. Jonathan's business acumen complemented my artistic sensibilities. His steady, practical nature balanced my more passionate approach to causes I believed in. We shared the same values, the same social circle, the same vision for our future together. We planned to have children within a few years, to maintain homes both in Willowbrook and Manhattan, to continue our family's traditions of community service and civic responsibility. But most importantly, we genuinely loved each other. Not the desperate, consuming passion that burns bright and fast, but the steady, enduring love that builds strong marriages and happy families. Jonathan made me laugh with his dry wit and unexpected moments of silliness. I challenged him to think beyond profit margins and consider the impact his business decisions had on the community. We spent Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper in comfortable silence, and Friday evenings trying new restaurants where we'd analyze the wine list and debate the merits of various preparations of duck confit. Our friends jokingly called us the golden couple because everything seemed to come so easily to us. Perfect careers, perfect families, perfect relationship, perfect wedding plans. We were living proof that the American dream was alive and well, at least for those privileged enough to inherit it and responsible enough to maintain it. Meanwhile, Dahlia was struggling. After a brief stint at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, which ended when she was caught selling term papers to other students, she had bounced between various jobs and relationships with an alarming lack of direction. She'd tried her hand at fashion design, event planning, real estate, and most recently, life coaching, though what qualifications she had to coach anyone about anything remained a mystery to our family. Her love life was equally chaotic. A series of relationships with increasingly unsuitable men, a struggling musician, a ski instructor with commitment issues, a cryptocurrency trader who turned out to be running a minor Ponzi scheme, had left her bitter and cynical about love. She claimed she preferred her independence, but I could see the loneliness behind her dismissive comments about marriage and family life. Which is why it came as such a shock when, 18 months before my wedding, she announced she was engaged to Trevor Blackthorne. Trevor was, on paper, exactly the kind of man our parents had always hoped Dahlia would find. He came from old money. The Blackthorne shipping fortune dated back to the colonial era and had recently taken over as CEO of the family's investment firm. He was educated, well-mannered, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely adore my unpredictable sister. The problem was, nobody could figure out why. Trevor was steady where Dahlia was flighty, thoughtful where she was impulsive, and reserved where she craved attention. They seemed to have nothing in common except their zip code and their trust funds. But he looked at her like she'd hung the moon, and for the first time in years, Dahlia seemed genuinely happy. Their wedding was a small affair, or what passed for small in our social circle, with only 200 guests at the Willowbrook Country Club. Dahlia wore a stunning vintage Chanel gown that had belonged to Trevor's grandmother, and for once she seemed content to follow traditions rather than rebel against them. I was her matron of honor, and despite our complicated relationship, I was genuinely happy to see her settled and secure. For about 6 months, it seemed like Dahlia had finally found her place in the world. She threw herself into the role of society wife with surprising enthusiasm, hosting dinner parties and joining the right charitable committees. She and Trevor bought a beautiful colonial house just 3 streets over from our family home, and there was talk of starting a family soon. But as my own wedding approached, something shifted. The closer Jonathan and I got to our perfect day, the more strained and bitter Dahlia became. She made cutting comments about my dress, questioned my flower choices, and seemed to take pleasure in pointing out every minor detail that wasn't going according to plan. At first, I attributed it to wedding stress. God knows I was feeling the pressure myself. But as the months passed, her behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. The night before my wedding, during the rehearsal dinner at Rosewood Manor, she pulled me aside in the ladies' room of the country club. "You know this is all just for show, right?" she said, touching up her lipstick in the antique mirror. "The perfect wedding, the perfect husband, the perfect life. It's all just an elaborate performance." I stared at her reflection, searching for any sign that she was joking. "What are you talking about, Dahlia?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've never done anything real or spontaneous in your entire life," she replied, capping her lipstick with more force than necessary. "Everything is so calculated, so designed to impress other people. Don't you ever want to just live?" The words stung more than I cared to admit, partly because there was a grain of truth in them. I had always been the responsible one, the planner, the daughter who colored inside the lines. But I'd also seen where Dahlia's spontaneity had led her. To disappointment, instability, and years of searching for something she couldn't name. "I am living," I said quietly. "I'm marrying the man I love, I have a career I'm passionate about, and I'm surrounded by people who care about me. If that's performing, then I guess I'm a pretty good actress." She turned to face me then, and for just a moment, I saw something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been more like you," she said. "If I'd played by the rules, followed the plan, made the right choices." "It's not too late," I told her, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "You have Trevor, you have your whole life ahead of you. You can still have everything you want." She squeezed back, and for a moment I thought we were having a genuine sisterly moment. "You're right," she said, her smile returning. "Tomorrow is going to be perfect." I should have paid more attention to the way she emphasized that word, perfect, as if she was making a promise, or perhaps a threat. Because the next morning, when she walked through those chapel doors in that ivory gown, I realized that Dahlia hadn't been reflecting on our conversation at all. She'd been planning her revenge. The morning of my wedding, I woke up in my childhood bedroom at the Montgomery estate at exactly 6 a.m., 2 hours before my alarm was set to go off. Sunlight was streaming through the lace curtains that had hung in that room since I was 12, casting familiar patterns across the hardwood floors that had witnessed every milestone of my life. I should have been nervous. Every bride is supposed to have some pre-wedding jitters. But instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of rightness, as if every decision I'd ever made had led me perfectly to this moment. I padded downstairs in my silk pajamas to find my mother already in the kitchen, despite the early hour. Anastasia Montgomery was not the type of woman to let her daughter's wedding day begin without proper nourishment, even if neither of us was particularly hungry. She'd laid out a spread that could have fed a small army. Fresh croissants from the French bakery in Hartford, perfectly ripe strawberries from our own garden, Belgian chocolate and coffee from beans she'd had specially imported from a plantation in Guatemala that she'd visited during one of her humanitarian trips. "You're up early, darling," she said, not turning around from where she stood at the marble counter, arranging flowers in a crystal vase. Even at 6 in the morning, preparing for her daughter's wedding, my mother looked impeccable. Her silver hair was already perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, her cream-colored silk robe elegant enough to receive the Queen of England. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, pouring myself a cup of the Guatemala coffee and inhaling its rich aroma. "Too excited, I think." She turned then, studying my face with the practiced eye of a woman who had raised 2 daughters and knew how to read their moods like weather patterns. "Any doubts?" It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of genuine concern. My mother had been married to my father for 32 years, had watched countless couples in their social circle navigate the treacherous waters of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. She knew better than anyone that a beautiful wedding didn't guarantee a happy marriage. "None," I said, and meant it completely. "Jonathan is perfect for me, Mom. We want the same things, we share the same values, we make each other better people. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and handed me a plate with a still warm croissant. "Your father and I felt the same way when we married." That certainty is a gift, Celeste. Not everyone is lucky enough to find their perfect match. We ate breakfast in comfortable silence, both of us aware that this was one of our last quiet moments, before the day transformed into a whirlwind of vendors, relatives, and carefully orchestrated events. Outside, I could hear the catering staff arriving to begin setting up for the reception at Rosewood Manor, their voices carrying across the morning air as they unloaded trucks full of linens, flowers, and the 1,000 details that would transform the historic estate into a fairy tale wedding venue. At 8 o'clock, my phone started buzzing with messages from my bridesmaids, all confirming their arrival times and asking last-minute questions about hair, makeup, and transportation logistics. Penelope texted that she was already at the salon, having decided that her usual sleek bob needed a, quote, emergency volume for the wedding photos. My cousin Miranda wanted to know if the something blue she'd found, antique sapphire earrings that had belonged to our great-grandmother, would work with my dress. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the detailed timeline I'd spent months perfecting. By 9:30, I was installed in the bridal suite at St. Augustine's Chapel, surrounded by my bridesmaids, the makeup artist, the hairstylist, and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. The room buzzed with excited chatter and the kind of nervous energy that accompanies all major life events. Miranda was filming everything on her phone for the wedding video, while my youngest bridesmaid, Jonathan's sister Evelyn, was live tweeting the getting ready process to her 3,000 followers. The transformation from regular Celeste to bridal Celeste took nearly 3 hours. My hair was styled in an intricate updo that incorporated my grandmother's vintage pearl hairpins, the same ones she'd worn to her own wedding in 1949. My makeup was classic and elegant, designed to photograph beautifully, but still look like myself. The dress, when I finally stepped into it, was everything I'd dreamed of since I was a little girl playing dress-up in my mother's closet. Standing in front of the full-length mirror in that bridal suite, surrounded by women who loved me and had traveled from across the country to celebrate this day, I felt like I was looking at the culmination of every choice I'd ever made. The reflection showed me exactly who I'd always wanted to become, a Montgomery woman, carrying on the family traditions while building something new and beautiful with the man I loved. At 11:45, my father arrived to escort me to the chapel. Judge Reginald Montgomery was not an emotional man. 30 years on the bench had taught him to maintain his composure under all circumstances. But when he saw me in my wedding dress, tears gathered in his eyes. "You look just like your grandmother did on her wedding day," he said, his voice unusually rough. "She would be so proud." "I hope so," I replied, taking his arm. "I hope I'm everything she raised Mom to be and everything Mom raised me to be." "You are," he said simply. "You're the best of all the Montgomery women who came before you." We made our way down the corridor toward the chapel's main doors, where I could hear the string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon, the signal that the ceremony was about to begin. My bridesmaids had already processed down the aisle, followed by Evelyn as my maid of honor. In just a few minutes, those doors would open, and I would walk down the aisle toward Jonathan, toward our future, toward the life we'd planned together in such careful detail. I was adjusting my veil one final time when Penelope burst through the side door that led from the main chapel back to the bridal suite area. Her face was flushed, her usually perfect composure completely shattered, and she was moving with the kind of urgency that suggested an emergency. "Celeste," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "we have a situation." The words sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't have said why. "What kind of situation?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving to check that my grandmother's necklace was still properly fastened. "Your sister just arrived." I felt my shoulders relax slightly. "Oh, thank goodness." I was starting to worry that something had happened to her. You know how Dahlia is with timing? "She's wearing white." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I was certain I'd misunderstood. Dahlia might be dramatic, attention-seeking, and occasionally thoughtless. But she couldn't, possibly commit such a fundamental violation of wedding etiquette. It was unthinkable, like showing up to a funeral in sequins, or wearing a tuxedo to a baptism. "What do you mean?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I realized it was a ridiculous question. There wasn't really any ambiguity in Penelope's statement. "I mean, she's wearing a full-length ivory silk gown," Penelope said, her lawyer's training evident in the precise way she delivered the devastating facts, "with a train, and some kind of crystal headpiece that looks suspiciously like a tiara." My father, who had been quietly checking his pocket watch to ensure we stayed on schedule, looked up sharply. "I'm sorry, what?" "Dahlia is dressed like a bride," Penelope clarified, her voice rising slightly. "She's out there posing for photos with your relatives, and people are staring. Some of them are taking pictures. This is going to be all over social media within the hour." I felt something strange happening in my chest, a peculiar sensation, as if my heart had skipped several beats and then resumed with a different rhythm entirely. The excitement and joy that had carried me through the morning began to transform into something else, something cooler and more analytical. "Show me," I said quietly. "Celeste, I don't think," my father began. "Show me," I repeated, moving toward the window that overlooked the chapel's front entrance. From the second floor, I had a perfect view of the scene unfolding below. There was my sister, resplendent in ivory silk, that caught the September sunlight like spun gold. The dress was undeniably beautiful, a sleeveless A-line design with delicate beading along the bodice and a train that spread behind her like liquid moonlight. The crystal headpiece Penelope had mentioned was indeed tiara-like, catching the light as Dahlia turned her head to smile at our great-aunt Cordelia, who was taking pictures with her phone. But what struck me most wasn't the dress itself. It was Dahlia's demeanor. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic about her choice. She wasn't trying to blend into the background or minimize attention. Instead, she was glowing with satisfaction, posing deliberately for photos, accepting compliments from confused relatives who clearly didn't know how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. Trevor stood beside her in his charcoal gray suit, and even from this distance I could see the tension in his posture. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, and he kept glancing toward the chapel doors as if hoping to escape the increasingly awkward scene his wife was creating. Several times I saw him lean down to whisper something in her ear, probably suggesting they move inside, but Dahlia brushed off his concerns with a laugh and a wave of her hand. "She planned this," I said, the words emerging with crystalline clarity. "This isn't some fashion mistake or moment of poor judgment. She deliberately chose to wear white to my wedding." "I'll go down there right now and tear that dress right off her body," Penelope declared, her protective instincts in full force. "I don't care how many people are watching." "I'll go down there right now and tear that dress right off her body," Penelope declared, her protective instincts in full force. "I don't care how many people are watching." "No," I said, still staring down at my sister. "Don't do anything." My father placed his hand on my shoulder. "Sweetheart, we can handle this quietly. I'll have a word with her, suggest she change into something more appropriate." "There's nothing appropriate about this," I interrupted, finally turning away from the window. Dahlia didn't make a mistake. She made a choice. A very deliberate, very calculated choice designed to humiliate me on my wedding day. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of the string quartet and the murmur of guests taking their seats in the chapel below. Through the walls, I could hear the low buzz of conversation that suggested word of Dahlia's costume choice was already spreading through the assembled wedding party. For 28 years, I had been the good daughter, the responsible sister, the one who followed rules and respected boundaries. I had spent my entire life trying to maintain family harmony, making excuses for Dahlia's behavior, smoothing over her social transgressions, and protecting her from the consequences of her choices. But as I stood there in my grandmother's pearls and my perfect wedding dress, watching my sister pose for photos in white silk outside my wedding chapel, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. Dahlia had just shown me exactly who she was and what she thought of me, my happiness, and this moment I'd spent 2 years planning. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to believe her. What happened next was something I'll remember for the rest of my life, not because it was particularly dramatic, but because it was the moment I truly understood the depth of my sister's betrayal. The ceremony proceeded as planned. I walked down that aisle, said my vows, kissed my husband, and smiled for photographs, while Dahlia sat in the front pew like a second bride, her ivory gown a constant reminder that this day wasn't entirely mine. But it was during the cocktail hour at Rosewood Manor, as I was making my rounds to thank guests for attending, that the full scope of what Dahlia had done began to reveal itself. It started with small comments, whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, and the uncomfortable glances that followed me as I moved through the crowd. Mrs. Harrington, who had been my mother's bridge partner for 15 years, pulled me aside near the rose garden where cocktails were being served. Her weathered face wore an expression of barely contained outrage that immediately put me on alert. "Darling," she said, gripping my arm with surprising strength for a woman in her 70s, "I feel I must tell you something, though it pains me to do so on your wedding day." My stomach clenched with dread. "What is it, Mrs. Harrington?" "Your sister has been telling people the most extraordinary story," she began, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "She's claiming that you stole Jonathan from her." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, what?" "According to Dahlia, she and Jonathan were involved before you met him. She's telling anyone who will listen that you deliberately pursued him knowing about their relationship, and that today is some sort of vindication for her. She says the white dress is her way of reclaiming what was rightfully hers." I stared at Mrs. Harrington, trying to process what she was telling me. The idea was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that for a moment I wondered if I'd misunderstood. "That's impossible. Jonathan and I met at the Historical Society auction. Dahlia wasn't even there." "I know, dear. Those of us who know your family understand that this is pure fabrication. But she's been quite convincing with some of the younger guests. particularly those who don't know the full history. Mrs. Harrington's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I thought you should know what she's saying. Before I could respond, my cousin Miranda appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with anger and champagne. Celeste, we need to talk. Now. She guided me away from Mrs. Harrington toward a secluded corner of the terrace, where the sound of the string quartet would mask our conversation. Miranda had been my closest confidant growing up, the sister I'd wished Dahlia could be, and I could see from her expression that whatever she had to tell me was serious. I just spent 20 minutes listening to your sister spin the most incredible lies I've ever heard, Miranda began, her voice tight with fury. She's not just telling people about some fictional relationship with Jonathan. She's completely rewriting history. What do you mean? She's claiming that you've always been jealous of her, that you've systematically tried to undermine her happiness, and that stealing Jonathan was just the latest in a long pattern of sibling rivalry. Miranda took a gulp of champagne before continuing. She told the Pemberton twins that you sabotaged her college applications, that you convinced your parents to cut her off financially, and that you've been spreading rumors about her marriage to Trevor. Each accusation felt like another knife to the chest. Not because any of them were true, but because I was beginning to understand the calculated nature of what Dahlia was doing. This wasn't just a momentary attention grab or a poorly thought-out fashion choice. This was character assassination, delivered with surgical precision to maximum effect. There's more, Miranda continued grimly. She's been showing people photos on her phone, pictures of her and Jonathan that she claims prove their relationship. I managed to get a look at them when she was talking to the Ashworth relatives. They're obviously edited, Celeste, badly edited. But if you don't know that, they look convincing enough. My mind reeled as I tried to comprehend the scope of what my sister was attempting. She hadn't just worn white to my wedding. She had crafted an entire alternative narrative designed to cast me as the villain and herself as the wronged party. The white dress wasn't just inappropriate. It was a prop in an elaborate performance piece. How many people has she talked to? I asked, dreading the answer. At least 30, probably more. She's been working the room like a politician, targeting specific groups. College friends who don't know the family well, distant relatives who only see us at weddings and funerals, some of Jonathan's business associates who met her for the first time today. Miranda shook her head in disgust. She's smart about it, I'll give her that. She's not telling the same story to everyone, just planting seeds of doubt and letting people draw their own conclusions. I felt my carefully constructed perfect day crumbling around me. Every smile I'd shared with guests, every congratulation I'd received, every photograph we'd taken, all of it was now tainted by the knowledge that half the people present believed I was some sort of manipulative husband-stealer who had orchestrated this entire wedding as an act of revenge against my own sister. What about Trevor? I asked. What is he saying about all this? Miranda's expression darkened further. That's another problem. He looks mortified, but he's not contradicting her. A few people have tried to ask him about it, and he just changes the subject or walks away. His silence is making it look like there might be some truth to what she's saying. The full magnitude of the situation began to settle over me like a suffocating blanket. Dahlia hadn't just humiliated me. She had potentially damaged my reputation, my marriage, and my standing in the community that had been my family's home for generations. The story she was spreading would follow Jonathan and me for years, creating doubt and suspicion in every social interaction, every business relationship, every friendship. I excused myself from Miranda and made my way to the ladies' room in Rosewood Manor's main house, needing a moment alone to process what I'd learned. The bathroom was elegantly appointed with marble fixtures and antique mirrors, a peaceful sanctuary where I could gather my thoughts without the pressure of maintaining my bridal smile. But even there, I couldn't escape the impact of Dahlia's campaign. As I was touching up my lipstick, 2 women I didn't recognize entered, clearly not realizing I was in one of the stalls. "Did you hear what the bride's sister was saying?" one of them asked, her voice carrying the excitement of someone sharing particularly juicy gossip. "About the groom? It's wild if it's true. Imagine stealing your own sister's boyfriend and then having the nerve to invite her to the wedding." "Well, look how she dressed," the second woman replied. "You don't wear white to someone else's wedding unless you're making a statement. And that statement is pretty clear." I feel sorry for the sister, honestly. She seems really sweet, and she's obviously still not over him. "Did you see how she was looking at the groom during the ceremony?" I remained frozen in the stall, hardly breathing, as they continued their speculation. These were complete strangers, probably plus ones of other guests, and they had completely bought into Dahlia's version of events. If she could convince people who had no prior knowledge of our family dynamics, how many others had she successfully manipulated? When they finally left, I emerged from the stall and stared at myself in the antique mirror. The woman looking back at me was still wearing the perfect wedding dress, still had the perfect hair and makeup, still bore all the external trappings of a fairy tale bride, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. The joy and excitement that had carried me through the morning had been replaced by a cold, calculating anger that I barely recognized as my own. I pulled out my phone and quickly scrolled through the photos that had already been posted to social media. There they were, dozens of images from my wedding day, but in every single one that included Dahlia, she dominated the frame. Her white dress caught the light, drew the eye, made her the focal point, even when she was supposed to be a background figure. The comments ranged from confused, "Wait, which one is the bride?" to supportive, "Love that the sister wore white, so bold," to outright malicious, "Looks like someone's making a statement about the groom." The realization hit me with startling clarity. Dahlia hadn't just worn white to my wedding. She had turned my wedding into her stage, my special day into her performance, my reputation into collateral damage in whatever twisted game she was playing. And she had done it all with a smile, accepting congratulations and posing for photos as if she were the guest of honor, rather than the architect of an elaborate social demolition. Standing in that marble bathroom, surrounded by the ghostly elegance of Rosewood Manor, I made a decision that would change the course of the next 3 years of my life. I wasn't going to confront Dahlia today. That would only create more drama and give her more attention, which was clearly what she wanted. I wasn't going to defend myself against her lies or try to convince people of the truth. That would make me look desperate and guilty. Instead, I was going to remember exactly what she had done, exactly how she had done it, and exactly how it felt to watch someone I loved systematically try to destroy something precious to me. Because if Dahlia wanted to play games, I was about to become a much better player than she ever imagined. Walking back out to my own wedding reception was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to find Dahlia and confront her publicly, to expose her lies in front of everyone, to defend myself against the character assassination she was orchestrating with such calculated precision. But something deeper, some survival instinct I didn't even know I possessed, told me that playing into the drama was exactly what she wanted. So instead, I did something that surprised even myself. I became the perfect bride. I glided back into that reception with a smile so radiant it could have powered the string lights hanging from the garden pavilion. I laughed at every joke, remembered every guest's name, and made sure to spend meaningful time with each table of attendees. When people mentioned Dahlia's dress or made awkward comments about her bold fashion choice, I simply smiled serenely and redirected the conversation to how grateful I was that everyone could be there to celebrate with Jonathan and me. "Oh, you know, Dahlia," I said with a light laugh when Mrs. Pemberton made a pointed comment about the appropriateness of certain wedding attire. "She's always been one to make a statement. I'm just happy she could be here for our special day." The response was perfect, gracious enough to maintain the moral high ground while subtly highlighting just how inappropriate Dahlia's behavior actually was. I watched Mrs. Pemberton's eyebrows raise in a way that suggested she was impressed by my composure and increasingly suspicious of my sister's motives. I used the same strategy throughout the evening. When confronted with Dahlia's lies about Jonathan, I responded with confusion so genuine that it made her claims seem even more outrageous. "I'm sorry, what?" I said to Jonathan's college roommate Marcus when he awkwardly asked about my sister's history with my new husband. Dahlia and Jonathan barely knew each other before Trevor and I started dating. I think there might be some confusion. The key was in my delivery, not defensive or angry, but genuinely puzzled, as if the very suggestion was so absurd it couldn't possibly be taken seriously. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare, and I was discovering I had a natural talent for it. Jonathan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. During our first dance, he held me closer than usual and whispered urgently in my ear. "Celeste, what the hell is going on with your sister? People keep asking me the strangest questions about some supposed relationship we never had." I looked up into his gray eyes, seeing the confusion and hurt there. My new husband was a good man, honest, straightforward, completely incapable of the kind of manipulation Dahlia specialized in. He had no idea how to handle this situation, and that innocence was actually working in our favor. "She's told some people that you two were involved before we met," I explained quietly as we swayed to the music. "It's completely fabricated, but she's been very convincing." His face darkened with anger. "That's insane. Should I say something? Make an announcement or—" "No," I said quickly, placing my hand on his chest to calm him. "Let me handle this. If you react strongly, it might make people think there's some truth to what she's saying. The best thing you can do is exactly what you're doing. Be confused by the whole thing." It was in that moment, dancing with my husband while my sister held court at her table in her white dress, that I realized I was no longer the same person who had woken up that morning. The old Celeste would have dissolved into tears, would have let Dahlia's cruelty ruin her perfect day. This new version was calculating angles, managing perceptions, and playing a game I'd never even realized existed. The real test came during the toasts. I had specifically asked for only family toasts, my father, Jonathan's father, and as maid of honor, Penelope. But as the microphone was being passed around, Dahlia suddenly stood up at her table, her ivory gown catching the light from the chandelier above. "I'd like to say something about my sister," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent reception hall. My blood ran cold. Every guest turned to look at her, and I could see the anticipation on their faces. Some excited by the prospect of drama, others uncomfortable but unable to look away. This was the moment Dahlia had been building toward all evening, the grand finale of her performance. I had perhaps 3 seconds to decide how to handle this. I could interrupt her, cause a scene, make it clear that she wasn't supposed to speak, or I could let her dig her own grave. I chose the latter. "Of course," I said graciously, gesturing for her to continue while keeping my expression warm and welcoming. "Family is everything." Dahlia's smile faltered for just a moment. She had clearly expected resistance, not encouragement, but she recovered quickly, walking toward the microphone with the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. "Growing up with Celeste was," she began, pausing dramatically as she accepted the microphone from the DJ. "Well, it was complicated." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the tone anyone expected from a sister's wedding toast. "Celeste has always been the golden child," Dahlia continued, her voice taking on a wistful quality that would have seemed genuine to anyone who didn't know her as well as I did. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect choices. Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to be her, to have everything come so easily. I kept my expression carefully neutral, even as I recognized the setup. She was establishing herself as the underdog, the overlooked sister, preparing the audience to sympathize with whatever was coming next. "And then she met Jonathan," Dahlia said, turning to smile at my husband with an expression that managed to convey both warmth and something deeper, something more intimate. And I thought, finally, here's something we might share. The room went dead silent. Even the waitstaff stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. But that's the thing about Celeste, Dahlia continued, her voice growing stronger. She doesn't like to share. She never has. When we were children, she would take my toys, my friends, my opportunities. And now, she gestured around the room with the microphone, as if the wedding itself was evidence of some greater theft. Well, now she has everything she's ever wanted. And I couldn't be happier for her. The last sentence was delivered with such perfect insincerity that even the most socially oblivious guests could sense the undercurrent of malice. But the beauty of what she'd done was that she hadn't actually said anything actionable, hadn't made any specific accusations or told any outright lies. She had simply planted seeds of doubt and let the audience's imagination fill in the blanks. The applause that followed was scattered and uncomfortable. Most guests clapped briefly out of politeness, but the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. Instead of celebration, there was now tension, confusion, in the uncomfortable awareness that they had just witnessed a family drama play out in public. As Dahlia handed back the microphone, I stood up. Every eye in the room turned to me, waiting to see how I would respond to what was essentially a public attack disguised as a wedding toast. I walked over to my sister, who was still standing near the microphone stand, and did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I hugged her. It wasn't a brief, perfunctory embrace. I held her close, as if she had just delivered the most touching, heartfelt speech imaginable. I could feel her tense with surprise in my arms, clearly not having expected this response. "Thank you, Dahlia," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, my voice warm with apparent emotion. "That was so beautiful. I love you too." Then I took the microphone myself. "I think what my sister is trying to say," I began, looking out at the sea of confused faces, "is that we've both grown so much over the years. We're very different people. We always have been, but that's what makes our relationship special. Dahlia has taught me so much about being authentic, about being true to yourself no matter what anyone else thinks." I paused, letting that sink in while maintaining eye contact with several guests who had been most receptive to Dahlia's earlier lies. "She's shown me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let people see exactly who you really are, even when it's not what they expect." I smiled at Dahlia, who was standing frozen beside me, clearly realizing that I had just turned her attack into a compliment that actually highlighted her inappropriate behavior. "So thank you, Dahlia, for being yourself so completely, so authentically, and so publicly. It means more than you know." The applause this time was genuine and sustained. I had managed to respond to her cruelty with apparent grace while subtly undermining everything she had tried to accomplish. The guests were applauding what they thought was a gracious response to a touching toast, but the more perceptive among them were beginning to see through Dahlia's performance. As I handed the microphone back to the DJ and returned to my table, I caught sight of Trevor's face. He looked mortified, clearly understanding better than anyone what his wife had just attempted and how spectacularly it had backfired. But it was Dahlia's expression that I'll never forget. For just a moment, as she realized what I had done, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. The sweet, wounded sister disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating and absolutely furious. In that instant, I understood that this wasn't over. This was just the opening move in a much larger game, and Dahlia had just realized she was playing against a much more skilled opponent than she had anticipated. The rest of the reception proceeded smoothly, but I could feel the shift in the room's energy. People were paying closer attention now, watching both Dahlia and me with new interest, beginning to piece together the real dynamics of what they had witnessed. And I let them watch. I let them see me being gracious, loving, and completely in control, while my sister grew increasingly agitated and transparent in her attempts to cause drama. By the time Jonathan and I left for our honeymoon the next morning, I had successfully reframed the entire narrative. Instead of the victim of my sister's cruel lies, I had become the gracious bride who handled family drama with extraordinary poise. But more importantly, I had learned something vital about myself. When pushed to my absolute limit, I didn't break. I got strategic. The honeymoon in Tuscany should have been the perfect escape from the drama Dahlia had created, but instead, it became my crash course in understanding exactly what kind of war one was fighting. Jonathan and I spent our days touring vineyards and exploring medieval hilltop towns, but my evenings were consumed with monitoring the digital aftermath of our wedding through social media, text messages, and phone calls from concerned friends and family members. The photos from the reception had been uploaded by dozens of guests, and the comment sections told a story that was both infuriating and illuminating. Dahlia's white dress dominated every image she appeared in. But now, thanks to my strategic response to her toast, people were beginning to interpret her choice differently. What had initially seemed bold and mysterious was now being viewed as desperate and attention-seeking. "Did anyone else think the sister's dress choice was weird?" read one comment that had 37 likes. "The bride handled that toast situation with such grace, I would have lost it if my sister pulled something like that," wrote another. But more importantly, I was learning from the comments and private messages I received just how extensive Dahlia's pre-wedding campaign had been. Miranda had been right about the scope of her lies, but she had underestimated their sophistication. As I scrolled through message after message from friends asking for clarification about various stories Dahlia had told, I began to see the full architecture of her deception. She hadn't just made up one story about Jonathan and herself. She had created an entire alternative history of our family, carefully crafted to make me the villain in every scenario. According to Dahlia's version of events, I had sabotaged her college applications by submitting fake recommendation letters under our parents' names. I had deliberately introduced her to unsuitable boyfriends to keep her from finding happiness. I had convinced our parents to reduce her trust fund by claiming she was financially irresponsible. And yes, I had stolen Jonathan from her after they had been secretly dating for months. Each lie was just plausible enough to seem believable, just specific enough to sound like inside information, and just dramatic enough to be memorable. She had been building this narrative for months, possibly years, testing different versions with different audiences to see what worked best. The genius of it was that she had never told the complete story to any single person. Instead, she had shared fragments, a hint here, a confession there, a reluctant admission extracted during what seemed like a moment of vulnerability. This meant that when people compared notes, as they inevitably did at social gatherings, they felt like they were piecing together a puzzle rather than being told a coordinated lie. It was sophisticated psychological warfare, and I was both horrified and grudgingly impressed by its elegance. But Dahlia had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated my capacity for patience and systematic thinking. While she had been focused on creating maximum drama and immediate impact, I was beginning to understand that this was a long-term campaign that required long-term strategy. So I began to prepare. The first thing I did was document everything. Every lie Dahlia had told, every person she had told it to, every piece of evidence that contradicted her version of events. I created a detailed timeline that stretched back over 5 years, cross-referencing her claims with actual events, photographs, and witness accounts. By the time I finished, I had a 40-page document that methodically dismantled every aspect of her fabricated narrative. The college application sabotage, for instance, fell apart completely when I found the actual recommendation letters in our father's files, letters that were clearly written in his distinctive handwriting and signed with his official judicial seal. The claim about introducing her to unsuitable boyfriends was laughable when I mapped out the actual timeline of her relationships, most of which she had hidden from the family until they inevitably imploded. The accusation about her trust fund was easily disproven by financial records that showed her distributions had been reduced only after she had overdrawn her account by $40,000 in a single month. But it was the Jonathan story that required the most careful attention because it was the most damaging and the most public. Here, I had a significant advantage. Jonathan and I had documented our relationship obsessively from the very beginning. We had saved every text message, every email, every photo. Our first date had been chronicled on both our social media accounts. Our early relationship had been witnessed by dozens of mutual friends who could testify to the timeline. More importantly, I realized that Dahlia's edited photos, the ones Miranda had mentioned seeing, were actually evidence of her deception, not proof of her relationship with Jonathan. When I examined them closely, I could see the telltale signs of digital manipulation: inconsistent lighting, slightly blurred edges where images had been combined, and, most damning of all, metadata that showed when the photos had been created. Every single proof of her relationship with Jonathan had been manufactured within the past 6 months, long after our engagement had been announced. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed to understand Dahlia's psychology, her methods, her vulnerabilities. So I began studying her behavior patterns with the same analytical approach I used for my foundation's strategic planning. What I discovered was both enlightening and disturbing. Dahlia's lies weren't random or spontaneous. They followed a clear pattern. She always positioned herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. She always targeted people who had something she wanted but couldn't obtain through legitimate means. And she always waited until her targets were at their most vulnerable or distracted before launching her attacks. The wedding had been perfect timing from her perspective. I was focused on the ceremony and celebration, unlikely to notice or respond to her campaign until it was too late. The social setting made it impossible for me to defend myself without appearing petty or vindictive, and the emotional significance of the day made any response I might make seem disproportionate to her innocent behavior. But Dahlia had also revealed something crucial about her methods. She needed an audience to validate her performance. Her lies weren't just about hurting me. They were about positioning herself as the protagonist of a more interesting story than her actual life provided. She craved the sympathy, the attention, the drama of being wronged. This gave me an idea for how to defeat her. During my second week in Tuscany, I called my old college roommate, Sarah Chen, who now worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud cases. I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the potential legal implications of Dahlia's defamation campaign. What you're describing sounds like a coordinated effort to damage your reputation and potentially your business, Sarah said after I finished laying out the evidence. Depending on how far she's willing to take this, you might have grounds for a civil suit. I'm not interested in suing my sister, I replied, but I am interested in understanding exactly what she's capable of and what she might do next. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You want me to investigate her? I want you to help me protect myself. If Dahlia is willing to fabricate an entire relationship with my husband and create fake evidence to support her claims, what else might she be willing to do? What other lies has she told? What other evidence has she manufactured? What Sarah discovered over the following weeks was both shocking and oddly reassuring. Dahlia's deception wasn't limited to our family. She had been running similar campaigns against various people for years. Former roommates, ex-boyfriends, business partners, even Trevor's family members had all been subjected to her lies and manipulations at different times. The pattern was always the same: identify someone who had something she wanted, create a narrative that positioned her as the wronged party, systematically undermine their relationships and reputation, then swoop in to claim whatever prize she had been targeting. But here's what Sarah also discovered. Dahlia's lies always eventually collapsed under scrutiny. She was skilled at creating initial confusion and drama, but she lacked the patience and attention to detail necessary to maintain complex deceptions over time. Her stories were full of inconsistencies that became obvious once someone took the time to examine them carefully. More importantly, she had developed a reputation among certain circles as someone whose stories didn't quite add up. Several of her former targets had quietly compared notes over the years, and a picture was emerging of a woman who lived in a fantasy world of her own creation. The good news, Sarah told me during one of our regular check-ins, is that most people eventually see through her act. The bad news is that she usually causes significant damage before that happens. How long does it typically take? I asked. Anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how much access she has to her targets and how willing people are to believe her initial story. 2 years. That was a long time to live with the cloud of suspicion Dahlia had created around my marriage and my character. But it was also enough time to prepare a comprehensive response that would not only clear my name but expose her pattern of behavior to everyone who mattered. I spent the remainder of my honeymoon developing what I privately called the Dahlia Project, a systematic plan to document, counter, and ultimately expose every lie my sister had told about me and our family. It wasn't enough to simply defend myself against her current campaign. I needed to ensure that she could never launch a similar attack again. The plan had 3 phases: documentation, verification, and revelation. I would spend the next year quietly gathering evidence, building relationships with her previous victims, and constructing an unassailable case that demonstrated her pattern of deception. Then I would wait for her to make another move, because I was certain she would, and when she did, I would be ready. By the time Jonathan and I returned to Willowbrook, I had transformed from a wounded victim into something much more dangerous. A woman with a plan, unlimited patience, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Dahlia had wanted to play games with my reputation and my happiness. She was about to discover that some games have consequences she never saw coming. Returning to Willowbrook after the honeymoon was like stepping into a carefully orchestrated social minefield. Every conversation carried subtext. Every social interaction felt loaded with unspoken questions, and I could practically feel people watching Jonathan and me for signs of the dramatic instability Dahlia had suggested lurked beneath our perfect facade. But I had spent 2 weeks in Tuscany preparing for exactly this scenario, and I was ready to begin phase 2 of my long-term strategy, building an unshakable network of allies. The first person I approached was someone I knew Dahlia would never suspect: Trevor's mother, Constance Blackthorne. Constance was old-money aristocracy in the truest sense, a woman who could trace her lineage back to the Mayflower, and who had been raised to value discretion, loyalty, and family honor above all else. She was also, I had realized during my honeymoon research, someone who had been dealing with Dahlia's manipulations far longer than anyone in my family had understood. I called her 3 days after returning from Italy, ostensibly to thank her for attending the wedding and to arrange a lunch meeting to discuss a potential collaboration between my foundation and one of her charitable organizations. But my real purpose was something entirely different. We met at the Willowbrook Country Club on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the sunroom overlooking the 18th green where the autumn light filtered through crystal glasses and cast elegant shadows across the white linen tablecloth. Constance was impeccably dressed, as always, in a tailored navy suit with pearls that had probably been in her family for generations. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and her manner gracious but reserved in the way that only true aristocrats could manage. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed legitimate foundation business. Constance's pet project was a literacy program for adult learners, something that aligned beautifully with my foundation's educational mission. We talked about potential partnerships, funding opportunities, and implementation strategies with the kind of detailed precision that both of us appreciated. But then I carefully steered the conversation toward more personal territory. "I hope Trevor and Dahlia enjoyed the wedding," I said, cutting into my perfectly prepared salmon. "It means so much to have family there for important moments." Constance's expression remained neutral, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested I had hit a nerve. "Of course," she replied diplomatically. Though I must say, your sister certainly made memorable fashion choices. It was the opening I had been waiting for. Oh, you know Dahlia, I said with a light laugh. She's always been one to express herself boldly. Sometimes I think she forgets that not every occasion is about making a personal statement. Indeed. Constance set down her fork with deliberate precision. I've noticed that tendency in her interactions with our family as well. The words were spoken quietly, almost casually, but they carried the weight of years of accumulated frustration. I realized that Constance was offering me an opening to discuss something that had clearly been bothering her for a long time. Has she been difficult? I asked gently, maintaining the tone of concerned family member rather than gossiping sister-in-law. What followed was a revelation that exceeded even my carefully researched expectations. For the past 2 years since Trevor and Dahlia's engagement, Constance had been dealing with a campaign of subtle manipulation and boundary violations that followed the exact same pattern I had documented in my other research. Dahlia had started small, suggesting changes to family traditions, questioning decisions about holiday celebrations, offering unsolicited advice about Trevor's career and financial management. When Constance had politely deflected these suggestions, Dahlia had escalated to more direct confrontations, accusing her new mother-in-law of being controlling, old-fashioned, and resistant to change. She told Trevor that I had made inappropriate comments about their engagement ring, Constance confided, her voice tight with controlled anger. She claimed I had said it wasn't good enough for a blackthorn bride, which was completely fabricated. I had actually complimented the ring. It was my grandmother's, and I was delighted to see it being worn again. The pattern was becoming sickeningly familiar. Dahlia had created conflict where none existed, then positioned herself as the victim of unreasonable family members who didn't understand or appreciate her. She's also been creative with family history, Constance continued. At last year's Christmas dinner, she told several guests a fascinating story about how the Blackthorns had made their fortune through questionable business practices in the shipping industry. When I corrected her, our records are quite clear about the legitimate nature of our ancestors' success. She accused me of being defensive and trying to whitewash the family's past. I nodded sympathetically while mentally adding this information to my growing database of Dahlia's tactics. She didn't just lie about people directly. She created narratives that undermined their credibility and social standing in subtle but persistent ways. The most frustrating part, Constance added, stirring her tea with controlled movements, is that Trevor seems to believe her version of events, or at least he refuses to contradict her publicly. I think he's caught between wanting to support his wife and knowing that her stories don't align with reality. This was exactly the insight I needed. Trevor wasn't actively participating in Dahlia's deceptions, but his silence was enabling them to continue. More importantly, he was clearly struggling with the cognitive dissonance of loving someone whose behavior he couldn't defend. I've been wondering, I said carefully, if there might be a way to help Trevor see the situation more clearly, not to cause problems in his marriage, but to help him understand that he doesn't have to choose between supporting Dahlia and maintaining honest relationships with his family. Constance studied my face intently, clearly recognizing that we had moved beyond casual conversation into strategic planning territory. What did you have in mind? Over the next hour, we developed what would become the foundation of my alliance network. Constance agreed to begin documenting Dahlia's lies and manipulations with the same systematic approach I was using. More importantly, she offered to quietly reach out to other family members and friends who had been subjected to similar treatment. I think you'll find, she said, as we prepared to leave, that your sister has made more enemies than she realizes. People have been tolerating her behavior out of politeness and family loyalty, but there's a growing consensus that something needs to be done. My next recruit was my college roommate Sarah, the private investigator, but this time I asked her to join my team in a more official capacity. I hired her firm to conduct a comprehensive background investigation into Dahlia's financial and personal history, focusing particularly on any evidence of fraud, defamation, or other legally actionable behavior. What Sarah discovered was both alarming and useful. Dahlia had a pattern of using her family connections and social status to obtain credit, services, and opportunities that she had no intention of paying for or honoring. She had outstanding debts with several local businesses, had defaulted on 2 personal loans, and had been quietly blacklisted by at least 3 event planning companies after failing to pay for services rendered. More significantly, Sarah found evidence that Dahlia had been spreading damaging rumors about other people's businesses and personal lives for years. A former friend's catering company had lost several high-profile clients after Dahlia spread unsubstantiated rumors about food safety violations. Another acquaintance's marriage had been damaged by Dahlia's claims that she had witnessed infidelity that had never actually occurred. "She's not just lying about you," Sarah reported during one of our weekly meetings. "She's been running a systematic campaign to damage anyone she perceives as competition or threat. The good news is that several of her victims are ready to go on record about what she did to them." This was the breakthrough I had been hoping for. If I could demonstrate that Dahlia's behavior toward me was part of a larger pattern of malicious deception, it would be much harder for people to dismiss her actions as mere sibling rivalry or wedding day drama. My third major ally came from an unexpected source, Dahlia herself. 2 months after the wedding, she made the mistake of targeting someone with even less patience for manipulation than I had developed, my mother-in-law, Patricia Ashworth. Patricia was a formidable woman who had built her late husband's small textile business into a multi-million-dollar empire through sheer force of will and strategic thinking. She had no children of her own. Jonathan was her stepson, whom she had raised from age 10. But she had developed fierce protective instincts toward the family she had chosen to create. When Dahlia began spreading rumors that Jonathan's business success was actually due to unethical practices he had learned from Patricia's supposedly corrupt management style, she had chosen the wrong target entirely. Patricia called me directly, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Celeste, I think we need to have a conversation about your sister, and I think we need to have it soon." The meeting took place in Patricia's corner office overlooking downtown Hartford, in a building that bore the Ashworth name in brass letters 6 feet tall. Patricia sat behind a mahogany desk that had been her husband's, surrounded by awards, photographs with politicians and business leaders, and the kind of understated luxury that only comes from decades of genuine success. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about my management practices," she began, without preamble. "Stories that are not only false, but potentially damaging to both my reputation and Jonathan's career. I have it on good authority that these stories are originating from your sister." I nodded, pulling out a folder I had prepared for exactly this conversation. "I believe Dahlia has been targeting several members of our extended family with similar campaigns. Would you like to see the pattern I've documented?" For the next 2 hours, Patricia and I compared notes, cross-referenced timelines, and developed what would become the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation Willowbrook society had ever seen. Patricia brought resources I couldn't have imagined: a network of business contacts, access to professional investigators, and most importantly, the kind of credibility that made her word unquestionable in our community. By the time I left her office that day, I had assembled a team that included a former federal judge's wife, a successful businesswoman with extensive intelligence resources, and a private investigator with law enforcement connections. We had documented evidence of Dahlia's deceptions going back over 5 years, testimony from multiple victims of her manipulation campaigns, and a comprehensive strategy for exposing her behavior when the time was right. But most importantly, I had learned something crucial about building alliances. The most powerful allies are those who have their own reasons for wanting your enemy defeated. I hadn't had to convince any of these women to help me. I had simply provided them with the framework and resources to address problems Dahlia had already created in their own lives. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for Dahlia to walk into it. By spring, 6 months after my wedding, the infrastructure for what I had begun thinking of as Operation Dahlia was fully operational. My network of allies had expanded beyond my wildest expectations, creating a web of information gathering and strategic coordination that would have impressed a military intelligence unit. But more importantly, Dahlia had begun exhibiting the behavior patterns that Sarah's research had predicted: escalation. The trigger, as I had anticipated, was success. My foundation's annual gala that April raised over $200,000 for arts education programs, the highest total in our 7-year history. The event was covered by the Hartford Courier's Society pages, with a photograph of Jonathan and me cutting the ceremonial ribbon for our new mobile arts classroom taking up half the front page of the lifestyle section. Governor Harrison attended as the keynote speaker, and 3 state senators made appearances to discuss upcoming education legislation. For someone who craved attention and validation as desperately as Dahlia did, watching her younger sister receive public recognition for meaningful work while she remained relegated to the social periphery was apparently unbearable. The first sign of her escalation came through Trevor, who called Jonathan directly, an unusual breach of family protocol that immediately set off alarm bells. "She's been talking about starting her own foundation," Trevor told my husband during what was supposed to be a casual conversation about golf plans. "Something focused on supporting women entrepreneurs. She's been researching grant applications and meeting with potential board members." Jonathan relayed this information to me that evening as we sat in our living room, reviewing invitations to various spring social events. On the surface, Dahlia's interest in philanthropy seemed positive, even admirable. But I had been studying my sister's behavior patterns for months, and I recognized this development for what it really was: the opening move in a new campaign designed to undermine my professional credibility. "Did Trevor mention any specifics about her foundation's mission?" I asked, already pulling out my laptop to begin researching. "He seemed uncomfortable talking about it," Jonathan replied, "but he did mention that she's been very critical of existing educational foundations. Apparently, she thinks they're inefficient and poorly managed." The implications were clear. Dahlia wasn't just starting a foundation. She was positioning herself as the superior alternative to my organization, preparing to launch a public critique of my work under the guise of promoting her own charitable interests. I called Patricia Ashworth the next morning. "She's making her next move," I reported. "We should expect a coordinated campaign questioning the effectiveness of my foundation, probably timed to coincide with her own organization's launch announcement." Patricia's response was immediate and decisive. "Then we need to accelerate our timeline. Are you ready for the final phase?" The final phase was something we had been planning for months, a comprehensive exposure of Dahlia's pattern of deception, presented not as a personal vendetta, but as a community service announcement about someone who was attempting to exploit charitable donors and volunteers. The key was documentation, and over the past 6 months, my team had assembled a portfolio that would have satisfied the most demanding prosecutor. We had signed affidavits from 8 different individuals who had been victims of Dahlia's lies and manipulations. We had financial records showing her pattern of defaulting on debts and commitments. We had screenshots and metadata from her social media campaigns, including the fabricated photos she had created to support her claims about Jonathan. Most importantly, we had testimony from 3 different nonprofit organizations that had rejected Dahlia's attempts to join their boards after conducting routine background checks that revealed her history of unreliability and false statements. But the masterstroke of our preparation was something that Patricia had suggested. We had created our own foundation specifically designed to attract Dahlia's attention and provide her with an irresistible target for her usual destructive behavior. The Willowbrook Women's Leadership Initiative was established as a legitimate organization focused on supporting female entrepreneurs and business leaders. Patricia served as the founding chairwoman, Constance Blackthorne was treasurer, and I was listed as a board member alongside several other prominent local women. The foundation was real, properly registered, and funded with genuine startup capital. But it was also a trap. We announced the initiative's launch through carefully placed mentions in society newsletters and social media posts, ensuring that the information would reach Dahlia through multiple channels. The Foundation's mission statement was written to overlap just enough with her stated interests to make intervention irresistible, while our board composition included exactly the kind of established, influential women whose approval Dahlia had been seeking for years. The response was faster than even our most optimistic projections had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of the announcement, Dahlia had reached out to Patricia directly, ostensibly to congratulate her on the new initiative, but actually to position herself as a potential collaborator. The conversation, which Patricia recorded with Dahlia's consent, under the pretense of keeping accurate records for board meetings, was a masterclass in manipulation and self-promotion. Dahlia began by praising the Foundation's mission while subtly criticizing other local charitable organizations for their outdated approaches and, quote, lack of real community engagement. She shared detailed stories about her own entrepreneurial experience, a fascinating reimagining of her actual employment history that transformed a series of failed business ventures into inspiring examples of innovative thinking ahead of its time. Most significantly, she offered to provide insider information about the challenges and inefficiencies she had observed in existing foundations, specifically mentioning my organization by name and suggesting that a fresh perspective was desperately needed in Willowbrook's philanthropic community. I think what Patricia and the other board members would find particularly interesting, Dahlia said, her voice taking on the confidential tone she used when sharing her most damaging gossip, is how some of these established organizations have been, let's say, less than transparent about their financial management and program effectiveness. It was exactly the opening we had been hoping for. Dahlia was not only positioning herself as a competitor to my foundation, but actively soliciting opportunities to undermine my work through what she believed was a sympathetic audience of influential women. Patricia played her role perfectly, expressing concern about the allegations and asking for specific examples that the board could investigate. Dahlia, clearly delighted to have found such receptive listeners, promised to compile detailed information about the problems she had identified with various local charities. I think you'll find that some organizations have been rather creative with their donor reporting, she confided. And there are questions about whether certain programs are actually serving the communities they claim to help. The conversation concluded with Patricia inviting Dahlia to attend the Foundation's first board meeting as a potential advisory member, contingent on her providing the documentation she had promised about other organizations' alleged shortcomings. Phase 3 of our operation was now in motion. Dahlia had been given rope, and as we had predicted, she was enthusiastically preparing to hang herself with it. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into what she clearly viewed as her opportunity to finally achieve the social status and influence that had always eluded her. She began researching my foundation with obsessive thoroughness, scrutinizing our financial reports, interviewing former volunteers and program participants, and reaching out to other board members with carefully crafted questions designed to uncover scandal or incompetence. But Dahlia had made the same mistake that had undermined all her previous campaigns. She assumed that her targets were as naive and unprepared as she needed them to be for her strategies to work. Every person she contacted about my foundation had been briefed by our team. Every document she requested was provided exactly as she asked for it, but with subtle modifications that would later prove her allegations were based on deliberately fabricated evidence. Every conversation she had was carefully managed to give her the impression that she was uncovering legitimate problems while actually providing us with detailed documentation of her methods and motivations. The board meeting was scheduled for the first Thursday in June, exactly 13 months after my wedding day. The location was Patricia's private conference room, the same space where she had agreed to become my ally 8 months earlier. The guest list included not only the Foundation's legitimate board members, but also several carefully selected witnesses who would be able to testify to what they observed. As the date approached, I found myself experiencing a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy. For over a year, I had been living for this moment, the opportunity to expose Dahlia's deceptions and protect myself and others from her manipulations. But now that the confrontation was finally at hand, I realized that I was also mourning the definitive end of any possibility of a genuine relationship with my sister. The woman who would walk into that conference room was someone I had once loved deeply, despite all her flaws and selfish behaviors. The woman who would leave that room would be someone I could never trust or forgive again. But as I reviewed the files documenting her attempts to destroy my marriage, my career, and my reputation, I reminded myself that Dahlia had made her choices. She had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over genuine relationship, and destruction over creation. Now she was about to discover the consequences of those choices, delivered with the same systematic precision she had used to try to destroy everything I cared about. The trap was set. The evidence was compiled. The allies were positioned. All that remained was for Dahlia to take the final step into the snare she had been building around herself for over a decade. The morning of the board meeting dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything in Willowbrook look slightly melancholy. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the rain streak down the glass while Jonathan finished getting dressed for his own meetings downtown. In 3 hours, I would sit across a conference table from my sister and watch her destroy herself, with the same methodical precision she had once used to try to destroy me. The irony wasn't lost on me that this confrontation was taking place almost exactly 13 months after my wedding day, the day Dahlia had first shown me who she really was beneath all the designer clothes and practiced charm. Since then, I had transformed from a naive woman who believed family loyalty could overcome any betrayal into someone who understood that some relationships are beyond redemption. "You don't have to do this," Jonathan said quietly, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "Even now, you could just walk away. Let her destroy herself without your involvement." I turned to look at my husband, this good man who had been caught in the crossfire of my sister's manipulations through no fault of his own. His reputation had been damaged by her lies, his business relationships strained by her fabricated stories about his professional ethics. He had every right to want justice, but he was still offering me an escape route because he knew the cost of what we were about to do. "She won't stop," I replied, the words carrying the weight of 13 months of careful observation and analysis. "If we don't end this now, she'll find new targets, create new lies, cause new damage. This isn't just about us anymore." And it wasn't. Over the past year, I had connected with 8 other victims of Dahlia's campaigns, women whose lives had been disrupted by her need for drama and validation. There was Margaret Chen, whose catering business had lost 3 major clients after Dahlia spread rumors about food poisoning that had never occurred. There was Jennifer Walsh, whose marriage had been strained by Dahlia's claims that she had witnessed Jennifer's husband with another woman, a complete fabrication that had taken months to disprove. There was Amanda Rivers, whose nonprofit had been investigated by state authorities after Dahlia submitted anonymous complaints alleging financial irregularities that didn't exist. Each of these women had eventually cleared their names and rebuilt their reputations, but not before experiencing months of stress, professional damage, and personal anguish. And each of them had agreed to provide testimony for today's meeting, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a shared determination to prevent Dahlia from victimizing anyone else. I arrived at Patricia's building 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review my notes one final time and ensure that every piece of evidence was properly organized. The conference room had been arranged with deliberate care, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, with Patricia's seat positioned at the head like a judge's bench. A court reporter had been discreetly positioned in the corner, and 2 video cameras were set up to record the proceedings from different angles. The other board members arrived promptly at 10:45, Constance Blackthorne, looking every inch the aristocrat in her navy Chanel suit, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the retired president of Willowbrook College, Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, whose family had founded the town's first bank, and Sandra Martinez, a successful businesswoman who had built a regional real estate empire from scratch. These were not women who could be easily fooled or manipulated. They represented generations of accumulated wisdom, professional success, and social influence. More importantly, each of them had agreed to participate in today's meeting because they had their own experiences with Dahlia's destructive behavior. At exactly 11 o'clock, Dahlia arrived. She swept into the conference room like she was making an entrance at a society gala, wearing a cream-colored Oscar de la Renta dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and carrying a leather portfolio that matched her Hermes handbag. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to achieve a long-sought victory. "Ladies," she said warmly, making eye contact with each board member as Patricia made introductions. "I can't tell you how excited I am about the work we're going to do together. The Willowbrook community desperately needs fresh perspectives on philanthropy, and I think this foundation could really revolutionize how we approach charitable giving in this area." It was a masterful performance, gracious, enthusiastic, and just humble enough to seem genuine. If I hadn't spent the past year documenting her lies and manipulations, I might have been impressed by her poise and apparent sincerity. Patricia called the meeting to order with the kind of formal authority that had made her one of the most respected businesswomen in Connecticut. "We're here today to discuss Ms. Montgomery Blackthorne's proposal to join our advisory board and to review the information she's gathered about potential improvements to our local philanthropic landscape." Dahlia opened her portfolio with theatrical precision, withdrawing a thick folder of documents that she placed reverently on the table. "I've spent considerable time researching the current state of charitable organizations in our community," she began, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when she wanted to sound professional and knowledgeable. "What I've discovered is quite troubling. Several organizations that present themselves as pillars of community service are actually operating with questionable financial practices and program effectiveness that falls far short of their public claims." She paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in before continuing. "I believe this board has a responsibility to bring these issues to light, not to damage anyone's reputation, but to ensure that donors' money is being used effectively, and that the communities we serve are actually receiving the help they need." It was beautifully done, positioning herself as a concerned citizen motivated by public service rather than personal vendetta, while simultaneously establishing the moral authority to level serious accusations against established organizations. "That's a significant allegation," Dr. Morrison observed mildly. "I assume you have documentation to support these concerns?" "Absolutely." Dahlia's smile widened as she began distributing copies of financial statements, program reports, and correspondence that she had clearly spent weeks compiling. "These documents show a pattern of financial irregularities, program failures, and misleading donor communications that I believe warrant immediate investigation." I watched the board members review the materials with expressions of growing concern. The documents looked official and damning, exactly as they were supposed to. Each piece of evidence had been carefully crafted to support Dahlia's allegations, while containing subtle but significant alterations that would later prove her accusations were based on fabricated information. "This is quite detailed," Constance murmured, flipping through pages of financial analysis that painted my foundation as a corrupt organization that had been systematically deceiving donors and misrepresenting program outcomes. "The pattern becomes clear when you examine the documentation systematically," Dahlia replied, warming to her subject. "For example, the Montgomery Cultural Foundation claims to have served over 3,000 children through their mobile arts classroom program, but when you cross-reference their reported activities with actual school district records, the numbers don't add up. They've been inflating their impact statistics to justify continued funding for programs that aren't delivering promised results." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Every person in that room understood the implications. If Dahlia's allegations were true, my foundation was guilty of donor fraud, a criminal offense that could result in prosecution and the complete destruction of everything I had worked to build. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression grave. "These are serious charges, Miss Montgomery Blackthorne. Before we proceed, I think it's important that we understand the sources and methods you use to gather this information." "Of course," Dahlia replied confidently. "Transparency is essential when dealing with issues of public trust." What followed was exactly what we had been preparing for over the past 8 months. Dahlia explained her research methodology with obvious pride, detailing how she had obtained internal documents, interviewed program participants, and analyzed financial records to uncover what she believed was systematic deception. But with each explanation, she was inadvertently providing evidence of her own deceptive practices. The internal documents she claimed to have obtained legitimately had actually been provided to her with deliberate modifications that made her allegations appear credible, while ensuring they could later be proven false. The program participants she had interviewed were actors Patricia had hired to provide false testimony. The financial records she had analyzed contained fabricated data that had been inserted specifically to support her preconceived conclusions. As Dahlia continued her presentation, building her case against my foundation with obvious satisfaction, I found myself feeling an unexpected mixture of admiration and revulsion. She was brilliant at this, weaving together facts and fiction into a narrative so compelling that even people who knew her history might have been convinced. But she was also walking directly into the most sophisticated trap that had ever been set for her, and she was doing it with such complete confidence that I almost felt sorry for what was about to happen. Almost. The moment of truth arrived exactly 43 minutes into Dahlia's presentation, just as Patricia and I had calculated it would. My sister had finished outlining her accusations against my foundation and was basking in the apparent concern and attention of the board members when Patricia asked the question that would trigger the avalanche. "Miss Montgomery Blackthorne, these allegations are extremely serious. Before we can act on this information, we need to verify its authenticity. Would you be willing to testify under oath that everything you've presented today is accurate and obtained through legitimate means?" Dahlia's confident smile never wavered. "Absolutely. I stake my reputation on the accuracy of this information." Patricia nodded gravely and pressed a button on the conference table that I knew would signal our court reporter to pay special attention to what followed. "In that case, I think it's appropriate to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, and that we have a certified court reporter present to document your statements for potential legal proceedings." For the first time since entering the room, Dahlia looked uncertain. "Legal proceedings?" "The allegations you've made constitute accusations of criminal fraud," Dr. Morrison explained in her calm, professorial tone. "If your evidence supports prosecution, we have a legal obligation to forward this information to the appropriate authorities. If your evidence doesn't support prosecution..." She let the implication hang in the air. I watched something flicker across Dahlia's face. Not quite fear, but a calculation. She was clearly wondering if she had miscalculated the situation. But her narcissism wouldn't allow her to back down from what she still believed was her moment of triumph. "I understand completely," she said, straightening her shoulders. "I'm confident that a thorough investigation will validate everything I've presented." Patricia smiled. Not the warm, encouraging expression she had been wearing throughout the meeting, but something sharper and infinitely more dangerous. "Excellent. Then you won't mind if we begin that investigation right now." She pressed another button, and the conference room doors opened to admit 3 people Dahlia clearly hadn't expected to see. Sarah Chen, my private investigator, Detective Michael Rodriguez from the Willowbrook Police Department's Fraud Division, and most devastating of all, Trevor. Dahlia's husband looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from prolonged emotional stress. But most significantly, he was carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who had finally reached the end of his patience. "Hello, Dahlia," he said quietly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from his wife. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." The transformation in Dahlia was immediate and dramatic. The confident, authoritative woman who had been lecturing the board about philanthropic ethics disappeared, replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened for the first time in my memory. "Trevor, what are you doing here? This is a private board meeting." "Nothing about this meeting is private," Patricia interrupted smoothly. "As I mentioned, we're recording everything for potential legal proceedings, and Mr. Blackthorne has some information that's relevant to the allegations you've been making." Trevor opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that I recognized as the culmination of months of careful documentation. "Dahlia, for the past year, I've been watching you systematically lie about my family, your family, and people we've known for decades. I've watched you create false evidence, manipulate photographs, and fabricate entire conversations to support stories that we both know are completely untrue." He placed the folder on the table with deliberate care. "These are copies of the original, unaltered documents that you've been using as the basis for your accusations against Celeste's foundation. As you can see, they tell a very different story than the versions you've presented today." Dahlia stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've shown this board is completely accurate." "No, it isn't." Trevor's voice was steady but carried an undertone of pain that made it clear how much this confrontation was costing him. "You've altered financial statements, fabricated correspondence, and created fake interview transcripts to support allegations you knew were false." Sarah Chen spoke for the first time since entering the room. "We have forensic evidence of the alterations, including metadata that shows exactly when and how the documents were modified. We also have testimony from the people you claim to have interviewed, all of whom state that the conversations you've described never took place." The color drained from Dahlia's face as the full scope of her situation became clear. She wasn't just facing professional embarrassment or social consequences. She was looking at potential criminal charges for fraud, defamation, and perjury. But even cornered, Dahlia's instinct was to attack rather than retreat. "This is a setup," she declared, her voice rising with desperation. "You've all conspired against me because you can't stand the fact that I've exposed the truth about Celeste's corruption. Trevor, how could you betray your own wife for these people?" Trevor's expression didn't change, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm not betraying you, Dahlia. I'm trying to save you from yourself. Do you have any idea what you've done? The people you've hurt? The lives you've damaged with your lies?" He opened another section of his briefcase and began placing photographs on the table, pictures of Dahlia meeting with various individuals over the past months, all of them people she had approached while building her case against my foundation. "These are surveillance photos showing you meeting with actors that Patricia hired to play the role of disgruntled foundation participants," he explained, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "You were so eager to find evidence of wrongdoing that you didn't question why these supposed whistleblowers were so easy to locate and so willing to talk." The implications were staggering. Not only had Dahlia fabricated evidence, but she had done so using information that had been deliberately planted to entrap her. Every piece of her case against me had been carefully orchestrated to demonstrate her willingness to use false information to destroy someone's reputation. Detective Rodriguez spoke up for the first time. "Miss Montgomery Blackthorne, based on the evidence presented here today, I'm prepared to file charges for fraud, defamation, and conspiracy to commit perjury. However, given your family's standing in the community and your husband's cooperation with this investigation, the district attorney is prepared to consider a plea agreement." Dahlia looked around the table desperately, as if searching for any ally or escape route. Her gaze lingered on me, and for a moment I saw something vulnerable and genuinely frightened in her eyes. "Celeste," she said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "You're my sister. You can't let them do this to me." It was the first time in over a year that she had addressed me directly, and the first time she had ever asked for my help rather than trying to manipulate or undermine me. For just an instant, I felt an echo of the affection I had once had for her, the protective instinct that had made me excuse her behavior for so many years. But then I remembered the wedding dress, the lies about Jonathan, the systematic campaign to destroy my reputation in marriage. I remembered Margaret Chen's catering business, Jennifer Walsh's marriage, Amanda Rivers' nonprofit, and all the other victims whose lives had been damaged by Dahlia's need for drama and attention. "You did this to yourself," I said quietly. "Every choice, every lie, every attempt to destroy something good in someone else's life, those were your decisions. I didn't create this situation, Dahlia. I just refuse to let you get away with it anymore." Patricia cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the legal realities of the situation. The plea agreement requires a full confession, restitution to all parties who have suffered damages as a result of your actions, and a legally binding agreement to cease all defamatory activities. It also requires you to publicly retract all false statements you've made about the various individuals and organizations you've targeted. "And if I don't agree?" Dahlia asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Then you'll face the full legal consequences of your actions," Detective Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "Fraud charges, defamation lawsuits, and potentially federal charges, if we determine that any of your activities crossed state lines or involved mail or wire fraud." The room fell silent except for the soft whir of the video cameras and the quiet clicking of the court reporter's machine. Dahlia sat motionless, staring at the evidence of her own deception spread across the mahogany table, finally understanding that there was no clever lie or manipulation that could extract her from the trap she had built around herself. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at her husband with tears in her eyes. "Trevor, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." But Trevor just shook his head sadly. "Yes, you did, Dahlia. This is exactly how far you meant for it to go. The only thing you didn't plan for was getting caught." The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed. Dahlia signed the plea agreement 3 days after the board meeting, her signature shaky but legally binding as she admitted to fabricating evidence, defaming multiple individuals, and attempting to defraud charitable donors through false accusations. The document was witnessed by her attorney, a criminal defense lawyer Trevor had hired despite their crumbling marriage, and notarized in the sterile conference room of the Hartford County District Attorney's office. I wasn't present for the signing, but Trevor called me afterward, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "It's done," he said simply. "She's agreed to everything. The public retraction, the restitution payments, the restraining orders preventing her from contacting any of her previous targets. She'll also be entering therapy as part of the agreement, though I'm not sure how effective that will be." The public retraction was published in the Hartford Courier the following Sunday, a full-page statement that methodically dismantled every lie Dahlia had told about me, my foundation, Jonathan's business practices, and the various other individuals she had targeted over the years. The language was formal and legal, stripped of the dramatic flair that had characterized her original accusations, but its impact was unmistakable. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from donors, board members, and community leaders, expressing their support and apologizing for any doubts they might have harbored. The Montgomery Cultural Foundation received 3 unsolicited major gifts that week, including a $50,000 donation from Patricia Ashworth's company with a note that simply read, "For truth and integrity in charitable work." But the most significant immediate consequence wasn't the vindication of my reputation or the strengthening of my foundation's position in the community. It was the complete collapse of Dahlia's social standing in Willowbrook. The retraction had detailed not just her lies about me, but the entire pattern of deception that had characterized her behavior for years. Margaret Chen's catering business suddenly made sense to everyone who had wondered about those mysterious food poisoning incidents. Jennifer Walsh's marital troubles were recontextualized as the result of malicious interference rather than genuine infidelity. Amanda Rivers' nonprofit was cleared of all suspicion, and the donors who had withdrawn their support began returning with increased contributions and heartfelt apologies. Within 2 weeks, Dahlia had been quietly removed from every charity board, social committee, and volunteer organization she had managed to join during her marriage to Trevor. Invitations to parties and social events stopped arriving. Even the most gossip-hungry members of Willowbrook society began avoiding her, not out of loyalty to me, but because they finally understood that associating with her meant risking becoming her next target. The isolation was swift and absolute, the kind of social death that can only occur in small, tight-knit communities where reputation is everything and redemption is nearly impossible. Trevor filed for divorce exactly 1 month after the plea agreement was signed. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone in Willowbrook understood the real reason. Even the most devoted husband couldn't continue defending someone whose lies had been so thoroughly and publicly exposed. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction watching my sister's world crumble. The victory I had spent over a year engineering felt hollow in the face of the complete devastation it had wrought. Dahlia lost her marriage, her social position, her credibility, and most of her financial security in the space of 6 weeks. It was exactly the comprehensive destruction she had been trying to orchestrate against me, but seeing it happen to her provided none of the vindication I had expected. 2 years later, I stood in the garden of our new home, a beautiful colonial that Jonathan and I had purchased in the historic district, just 3 blocks from where I had grown up, but far enough from the Montgomery estate to feel like a fresh start. The autumn light filtered through the maple trees we had planted the previous spring, casting golden shadows across the flagstone patio, where we were hosting a small dinner party for the board members of both my foundation and Patricia's Women's Leadership Initiative. The conversation was warm and animated, focused on upcoming projects and community initiatives rather than past dramas. My foundation had grown significantly in the 2 years since Dahlia's exposure, expanding our programs to serve over 5,000 children annually, and receiving recognition from the State Education Department for innovative arts integration practices. Patricia's foundation had become a legitimate force for supporting female entrepreneurs, with a track record of successful small business loans and mentorship programs that had nothing to do with the elaborate trap we had originally created. As I moved between groups of guests, ensuring everyone had wine and appetizers, I caught sight of my reflection in the French doors leading to the living room. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the naive bride who had discovered her sister's betrayal 2.5 years earlier. This version was more confident, more strategic, more aware of the complexities that lay beneath social pleasantries and family relationships. "You look thoughtful," Jonathan observed, joining me near the doors with a glass of the Burgundy we had brought back from our anniversary trip to France the previous month. "Just thinking about how much has changed," I replied, accepting the wine and leaning into his familiar warmth. "Sometimes it feels like a different lifetime." "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, the question carrying the weight of all the conversations we'd had about the moral complexities of what we had done to Dahlia. I considered the question seriously, as I had many times over the past 2 years. The systematic way we had entrapped my sister, the elaborate deception we had used to expose her own deceptions, the careful orchestration of her social and personal destruction, none of it aligned with the person I had believed myself to be before her betrayal changed everything. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally, "but I don't regret doing it. She had hurt too many people, and she would have continued hurting more if someone hadn't stopped her." Through mutual friends, I had learned that Dahlia was living in Portland now, working as a sales associate at a boutique and renting a small apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the social circles she had once tried to dominate. The therapy mandated by her plea agreement had apparently helped her develop some insight into her behavior patterns, though I had no direct knowledge of any real change in her character. Trevor had remarried the previous summer, a quiet ceremony in Vermont with a woman he had met through his business associates, someone with no connection to Willowbrook or the social dynamics that had shaped his first marriage. According to Constance, who maintained a cordial relationship with her former daughter-in-law despite everything, he seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. "Have you heard anything about how she's doing?" Jonathan asked, reading my thoughts with the intuitive understanding that had developed between us over the years. "She's surviving," I replied, which is more than she allowed some of her victims to do with their reputations and relationships intact. A burst of laughter from the patio drew our attention back to the party, where Patricia was regaling the group with a story about her latest business acquisition. The sound was warm and genuine, the kind of joy that comes from shared success and mutual respect, rather than the brittle excitement that had characterized so many of the social gatherings from my previous life. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I found myself thinking about the wedding ring that had inspired the title of this story, the one I had worn on a chain around my neck to Trevor and Dahlia's divorce proceedings 2 years earlier. It had been a small, symbolic gesture, a private acknowledgement of the poetic justice in watching her lose the marriage she had tried so hard to destroy mine to get. But the real victory hadn't been that moment of symbolic triumph. It had been the gradual rebuilding of trust, the strengthening of genuine relationships, and the creation of something more meaningful than the perfect facade I had once believed represented success. My phone chimed with a text message from Miranda, who was now living in San Francisco with her husband and twin daughters. The message contained a photo from her eldest daughter's school art exhibition, featuring a painting created using supplies donated by our foundation's expanded West Coast program. "Look what your program helped create," the message read. "Sophie says she wants to be an artist like the teachers who visit her school. Thank you for never giving up on what matters." I smiled, showing the photo to Jonathan as we finished clearing the last of the dinner dishes. This was what victory actually looked like. Not the dramatic confrontation or legal vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of work that made a real difference in people's lives. Relationships built on honesty and mutual respect, and the peace that comes from knowing you've protected others from harm. The woman who had worn white to my wedding had ultimately given me a gift more valuable than she could have imagined. She had shown me exactly who I was capable of becoming when pushed to my limits, and that person was stronger, more strategic, and more resilient than I had ever known. As Jonathan and I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to our bedroom, I caught one last glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The face looking back at me was serene, confident, and completely at peace with the choices that had brought me to this moment. Dahlia had wanted to play games with my happiness and my future. In the end, she had lost everything, while I had gained something far more valuable than revenge. The absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to destroy something precious to me without consequences. And that knowledge, more than any legal victory or social vindication, was the foundation upon which I had built my new life. Stronger, more authentic, and infinitely more satisfying than the perfect facade I had once mistaken for happiness. Some battles are worth fighting, not for the victory they provide, but for the person they reveal you to be when everything you value is at stake. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't just living well, it's becoming someone worthy of the life you've chosen to protect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.